I am delighted that we are now pushing towards the international approach to critical minerals, and I am going to introduce Ludivine Wouters, who is here. Ludivine is my partner in crime in the EU, and I'm going to let Ludivine introduce her panel. We're going to have a panel discussion on a competitive European continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we just sit down?
Yeah.
Ourselves. Do this.
You want to be in the middle?
Middle? Yeah. All right. Good morning. Nice to see you all. Many familiar faces, so nice to see you. We started this discussion also with one of the missing panelists, realized we had 2 whole days of things to discuss, so we're going to try and boil it down and keep on time. I'm going to introduce myself in a moment. Of course, ask my amazing panelists to introduce themselves. And the idea is to discuss a little bit, yes, the EU, because as you know, I saw a little bit of trouble in Brussels, but also the EU-UK dynamics in how we position in the critical minerals issues. So my name is Ludivine Wouters. I'm an advisor to mining companies and investors. At the moment, I advise primarily on mineral governance and policy issues, primarily critical mineral strategies and responsible sourcing strategies in the US and the EU at the moment. I will ask Marge to start, and then I'll move over to Philipa and Jane.
Thanks, Ludivine. So I'm Margery Ryan. Is this working? Where's it gone?
Voila.
Yeah.
Is it on?
Can you hear me? Yes? Good. Margery Ryan from Johnson Matthey, which is a major platinum group metals company. I work in the market research department at Johnson Matthey. I look after stakeholder education on the platinum group metals and increasingly on advocacy around those metals.
Thanks very much. Philip?
Hi, I'm Philipa Varris. Today I'm representing Mkango Resources, where I'm a non-executive director. And you saw on one of the previous presentations, Hypermag, which is one of our subsidiaries.
Jane?
And I'm Jane Joughin. I'm a sustainability consultant that's worked in the mining industry for 30 years. I'm also a director of SRK Global and a director of SRK Kazakhstan. Yeah.
Okay. I think what might be interesting is that what we just heard from the last presenter, and thanks for that incredible wrap-up, is that we're really seeing a little bit of a reality check on a lot of the criticality narratives. And in the EU, that reality check has just happened. We have, as of yesterday actually, a new commission that's been vetted by the parliament. I'm sure none of you are geeky enough to watch the hearings. I did. And as we move from the Green Deal and the first CRM Act initiatives and the first push on critical minerals, the reality check has come from 2 interesting drivers that together really force a rethink on criticality. The first one is the rise of the defense agenda. For the first time in its history, the EU today has a defense commissioner. The DG was created in 2019. It was made independent, and it's now a full-blown pillar of the commission. And Andrius Kubilius used to be the Prime Minister of Lithuania. So when he raises issues of immediate and existential threat, his voice really carries. What's interesting is that he makes the link to the defense industry stakes and therefore to the mineral stakes. Those are very clearly part of his ambitions and portfolio. The second thing that's shifting the CRM agenda in the EU at the moment is the rise of the competitiveness agenda. In and of itself, there's nothing new with competitiveness. What's happened is that competitiveness has gone from being an element of the Green Deal and positioning on transition stakes to, once again, a realization that there are immediate and existential threats to an EU global positioning, to EU ambitions and strategies in transition, but much wider. This has now become a whole of the economy approach. Let's not kid ourselves, to get 27 people to agree on a whole of the economy approach is hard. 27 nations is almost impossible. So Stéphane Séjourné, who's the new commissioner for competitiveness, is going to come up with a clean industrial deal integrating transition stakes and industrial stakes, and also taking over the CRM agenda, supposedly in his first 100 days in office. Let's see what you can do in 100 days to map out basically the future of the continent. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it's driving a couple of sometimes unexpected consequences. The first one is a prioritization. We just discussed the critical minerals list. You know that the EU has a critical raw materials, and within critical raw materials, strategic raw materials. So there's already been a kind of an idea of what's strategic based on technologies and sectors. Beyond that, we're now realizing that, yeah, some of the things that are not critical because of how they're placed in the matrix are actually quite essential, because you've got Italian steel makers saying, yeah, we're going to shut down a couple more facilities. When that happens, again, immediate and existential threat to communities, to entire countries, and to industrial strategies. And that's the other aspect, is that there's a realization that beyond prioritization, there needs to be an integrated view. And the UK is, to put it bluntly, back on the agenda because of its role in that integrated strategy. So one of the things that I'm hoping we can all discuss together is how the UK dynamics, both for the UK itself, but also the UK as a central place of finance, the UK as a leader in defining some of the standards by which we work and create these products, and the UK as a partner with the EU, how we can leverage some of the strengths and drivers of that relationship for better outcomes, but also what are some of the gaps, what are some of the issues and the priorities we think we all need to work on. So that's kind of where we started our conversation. I'd like to start with you, Marge, because as we were discussing exactly that, what are the issues and the drivers in the EU-UK dynamics and how they can together position in this global, I was going to say game, but it's not a funny one. And one of the points you immediately mentioned was, let's acknowledge our weaknesses but work to our strengths. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Absolutely, thanks, Ludivine. Yeah, I think we do need to start the conversation with what are the UK's strengths, both to inform the UK's own industrial strategy, but also because that's what we take to the table in conversations with partners like the EU and the US. I think what's been done on the criticality assessment, the critical minerals strategy is excellent and necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's a component of a wider metals strategy. I think, for example, I'd like to see more consideration given to the UK's role in enabling global metals markets and metals value chains, and that goes well beyond mining, by the way. There's a lot more to it than just mining. If I start with the example that I'm most familiar with, which is platinum group metals, the UK really enabled the global platinum group metals market. We were there at the genesis. And as a result, the UK doesn't mine platinum group metals, but we are the beating heart of global platinum group metal supply chains. The UK hosts the world's largest recycler of these metals. That's not a minor thing, by the way. Today, about 60% of the metal used on new products, new PGM products, is recycled. So we already have a situation where the urban mine for platinum group metals is more significant than the primary mine. So it's not a small thing. The UK facilitates a significant proportion of global trade in these metals, and we are at the forefront of PGM technology ever since, I don't know, we invented the fuel cell and perfected the world's first commercially produced catalytic converter. And how have we done that? We've done that by building on the UK's strengths, our ability to be a supportive, collaborative partner in international partnerships, our strength in science and innovation. I'm talking chemistry, material science, metallurgy, minerals processing, engineering, and leveraging London's position as a global financial centre. So London hosts all these trade associations and commodities exchanges that are really crucial to the global world of metals. And I'd like to see us building on that. So yes, we do need to look at risks, we do need to address risks, but we also need to address opportunities. And I don't want that to be forgotten. I can end with an example. At the moment, the UK and the EU, in terms of being competitive, can be incredibly competitive in the area of fuel cells. We have a leading position, particularly if we work together, EU, UK, as Europe. We can lead in fuel cells. China is catching up, and if we're asleep at the wheel, they will overtake us. So we need to give attention to nurturing those opportunities where they occur. Yes, risks are important, criticality is important, but so is industrial competitiveness, and we can work with the EU in terms of maximizing that for Europe as a whole. There are opportunities. Thanks
very much. And I think this ties to what you were discussing, Philipa, about the challenge of growing supply, but growing supply also means putting something into supply, which is the name of the game, investment.
So I've got to put on my miner's hat here now. I've spent 30 years working as an operator in the mining industry. And so I'm very aware of the fact that the industry has really, really struggled, and particularly in the junior space, to access capital, not only in recent years, but in recent past history as well. And without access to capital, we can't fund exploration. We can't replace those resources. Yes, we've got criticality assessments, the minerals are out there, but someone has to prove that they're mineable. And that takes money. We also need to be able to build the equipment that we can actually use to mine and process these metals. Then we've got the downstream manufacturing equipment. And then if we're thinking about in terms of transition plans, we then also need to have generation facilities and energy transmission systems, all of which need capital. And capital right now is limiting. Without these things, no one's going to achieve their transition plans. No one's going to achieve their Paris targets. So this is absolutely fundamental challenge for us. But as our other speakers have said, this is a real opportunity for the European continent because we have got very, very long and successful multilateral and bilateral partnerships and relationships that have been mentioned earlier this morning. That really gives this region a lot of credibility to be able to go out there and talk to emerging economies and suppliers of critical raw materials and to be able to use those partnerships to help build collaborations. And then to amplify on Margery's point, we've got the UK positioned as a strategic hub for the finance industry. So we've got the two pieces of the pie. Sorry, bad analogy, but you knew what I was talking about. So at risk of generalising though, we've got some challenges, and we've seen already that investor confidence in our sector is probably at an all-time low. So just to speak through some of those points, again with my miner's hat on, sorry fellow miners, you might have to beat me later on, but we've got to be honest, we've had some pretty poor underperformance in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 space in recent years. And that has made it really difficult for people to want to invest in us. We've seen already the concentrated geopolitical risk that's out there. That's also that's also affecting mainstream investors and their opinion of this sector versus the other sectors that they can choose to invest in, right? Which is really, really important. So we've got two levels of competition going on here. We've got competition that's going on within our sector, but we're also competing with other sectors for investment. And we've had numerous examples of this concentration of markets, so I don't think I need to kind of go into that any further. Then also in the mining space, we've improved recently. We've gone down in terms of our capital project overruns from 60% to 53%. Hey? Good work, mining industry. So, we're out there, we're saying to people, give us money, we want to build this major project, but we're going to probably come in 50% over, and our schedule is probably going to be 70% longer than we told you it was going to be. These are very real challenges that are affecting confidence in our industry. And then sitting underneath all of that, underscored by our earlier speakers, is the ongoing fluctuation in metals prices. So, you know, from the outside, we don't really look like a fabulous place to invest right now. So we're going to need help, aren't we? We're going to need different types of financial tools to help us get over this, because otherwise, globally, we're not going to make our transition plans and we're not going to meet our Paris targets. So I'm going to keep reflecting back on that. The UK's Transition Finance Market Review recently identified also long-term policy uncertainty as a risk, just our credibility as a risk, and they've added 2 more elements to the credibility that's already shot: greenwashing, which I'm sure someone would love to pick up later on, and credible decarbonisation impact. So, you know, a lot of people have gone out there and put their targets out for decarbonisation, but a lot of that is premised on transition technologies that don't exist yet. Okay, versus the investable opportunities. Sorry, I'm just throwing out all the bad ones because this is kind of... Yeah, I know, sorry for all of that. So I think probably my last point on the challenges that we all share and how that can position the European continent in terms of opportunities. As an industry, in the past, we used to hold up the junior end of our sector and say that this was the part that had the lowest common denominator as far as ESG performance goes. But I think it's fair to say that the number of high-profile failures in the majors end of the market recently as well has added another lens to the pain that our industry is now suffering, because there's now actually no safe place from an ESG perspective. And, you know, I don't think I need to point out the number of issues we've had recently. But these are all challenges. And as an industry, the solutions that we have to come up with have got to address all of these issues if we're going to be able to be successful in competing in the marketplace.
Okay. We need to talk about how we address those issues.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with James. One of the things that you consistently refer to is the importance of the knowledge pool and the capacity to build the narratives that actually foster the kind of success that we need to do better at. Do you want to explain some of that?
Well, on knowledge, those countries that are mineral rich and have an active mining industry have very, very high knowledge capital in the mining sector. In the UK, we haven't had mining for a very long time. We haven't had much mining for a long time. And the knowledge capital in general is quite low, with regulators as well. And the same is true in Europe. And it is reflected also in the law that we have for approval of mining projects. And it's something that we need to recognize. I'm talking specifically about mining in the upstream part of the value chain. I would like to leave it there. A particular thing I want to talk about is something I think is a gap, but you can bring it in later, and that links to localization and in-country value creation.
No, but let's expand on it.
Okay.
The fact is we're huge consumers as a region of minerals, but the EU very clearly said we intend to mine 10% at home, which basically means we're going to be relying on the world to produce these minerals for a long time. So without partnerships, without international engagement, none of this agenda happens, as is the case in the UK, where international partnerships are at the heart of the strategy. So the local value addition issue is global. I mean, it's in Canada as well as Zimbabwe in many different ways. So how can we position on that?
So in the discussions about mineral supply to the UK and to Europe, for me, feel that there's a gap in the discussion, or it's not covered overtly. And it relates to sustainability and it relates to supply chains. And its name in the countries that produce minerals is in-country value creation. The older term is localization or local content. So that's the positive name. The negative name that you can hear is resource nationalization, or it's referred to geopolitical risk. And I think this issue gets sorted into the wrong bucket when it is discussed, and I don't see it discussed overtly. And it's very, very important to recognize that in many mineral-rich countries outside of the UK and Europe, the minerals law has a very strong requirement for in-country value creation. That requirement, because in those countries the minerals are state-owned and the minerals law says that the minerals must be developed in public interest, the in-country value creation requirements are strongly expressed in law and very, very strongly expressed in the mineral rights that mining companies get access to. So it's in their licenses or permits or whatever it's called in that particular country. So, so if countries are working to extend their value chain as much as possible in country, that's beneficiation as much as possible in country, employing people locally as much as possible. What does it mean for Europe and the UK in terms of the secure supply of minerals? Sorry, I just want to finish off by saying I do think the major mining companies recognize it. If you go to ICMM and you look at their principles, because they have to report on this all the time to the governments. They have to. It's part of their mineral rights. It's part of what they have to report to government. It's part of what keeps them in a constructive relationship with the government, that in-country value creation. And if you look at the ICMM principles, for example, it's quite central to that. And so I just, for me, it's not overt. And sorry, the last thing, we said in the MSP talk earlier, local value addition. But does that talk to local value addition as expressed in the minerals law and the mineral rights that mining companies have in other countries?
I saw Philipa wanted to say something, but then I'll rebound and hand it to Marge, who actually is in the PGM, an example of complete distinction between the countries. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on Jane's point, and absolutely, when we talk about value creation, what we're talking about is making sure that positive benefits of mining operations or processing operations or downstream operations are occurring at the location the negative impacts are occurring. That is actually the fundamental point around sustainability, and we all sit here and talk about ESG standards. That's what ESG standards are. ESG standards, as a collective, are about returning value to the people who suffer the impacts. And the only way to do that is by having local employment and local procurement to the extent possible. So what does that mean for the European continent, where we don't, as Jane's rightly pointed out, we don't have a plethora of mines, we don't have a plethora of minerals, and we really don't have recent knowledge about mining? It's about the leadership that we can create around standards, and the work that we can do to help these economies, and particularly the emerging economies that are mineral rich, to be able to pursue those operations in a way that meets international standards. And that might be through funding, and funding having CPs, conditions precedent, that require adoption of certain standards, or it can be through the bilateral partnerships where we support people through regulatory partnerships to actually lift up their standards. We can't just pick up those minerals and magically shift them to somewhere else. So, and this is an area of extreme leadership that's available in the European continent, and really leading to our strength again.
Okay, I'm just going to challenge that a little bit.
Okay.
One of the things that the EU has put at the center of its strategic partnerships with mineral-rich countries is local value addition. The complexity there, and this is probably because I spent 10 years negotiating those deals with African countries, is that the agency of the parties, in my view, is very limited. Because mining companies are actually not processing companies, because the investors in those different operations, and I'm sure lots of you have views on this, are not from the same investment pool. And more importantly, because the market determines where it wants to buy what. So I'm always a little bit nervous when we put out a policy-driven view that we can exercise leadership in this? Because I'm not sure that the investment markets are following that. And
yep,
I'm definitely sure that the commercialization markets for minerals are not deciding on the basis of whether there's a policy in place or not.
No, you're absolutely right.
So there's a disconnect between what a market is saying and where we want to go in terms of policy positions. And I don't know, you were explaining the example of PGMs and the UK's leadership. How can that be overcome? And are there mechanisms to balance out the impacts and the benefits?
Okay, so you can take some good learnings from the platinum group metals, I think. I grew up in South Africa. I'm very uncomfortable with Western nations going to Africa and lecturing on standards. I mean, it shows an insensitivity to history that I think needs to be considered a bit more carefully. Yeah. We've got to approach these nations as equal partners. And that was very much the case with platinum group metals. The mining and the beneficiation happens in South Africa. The refining happens in South Africa. There's enormous local value creation. South Africa mandates community investment. If you're going to mine, you're going to have to invest in the local community. There is tremendous socio-economic good done by the platinum group metals industry in South Africa. How has the UK helped? We've helped by creating the market. LPPM has a very, London Platinum and Palladiums Markets Association has a very strong responsible sourcing initiative. It's market-led. The market has put it in place. South Africa benefits from that because there is significant local community investment. I think PGMs is a story of very good partnership between equals, the UK and South Africa both benefiting from that partnership. So I think it is possible. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with policy-led initiatives. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the approach the EU takes, which is we're going to pull you up to our standard. I don't think that's the right way to go, and I think you're probably not going to have a very fruitful conversation in a lot of African nations if that's how you go in. But if you come in saying, look, you want to sell your minerals, and ultimately at the end of the day, if we create a market for metals and minerals, we're the ones who then taking whatever's mined, however it is mined. So who's created the market for low ESG metal? Well, it's the consumers. So it's all about the market we create and the market signals we send. If we send the right market signals, we allow supply, I think, to do the right things. And I think that's the sort of conversation we should be having. I do think it needs to be market-led, but I think there are ways for players like the UK to have a significant influence in creating that market-led approach because we did it in PGMs.
Awesome. Now that we've veered completely away from the rundown we had prepared, let me try and get us back on course. And I want to go back to you, Philipa, because one of the elements that we're discussing here is, of course, the alignment of a series of projects that need to make sense together and the linkages. One of the points that you've already raised is the risk that's involved. Okay, what are some of the priorities or initiatives or positions that both the EU and the UK together could take around de-risking some of these projects?
Yeah, I'm trying to put my positive hat on here and think about things that things that can work versus the ones that perhaps are not as likely. I do wish I had the solution to this gap between responsible financing and the minerals that we need to actually develop. I think you've probably all worked out that 30 years in the mining industry as a practitioner. I'm not a finance lead. I haven't spent my time living in London. So this is something that I'm just grappling with. But I still think that the right products are not available to actually help the sector to move in a positive way. And to kind of speak from my own experience in a kind of well-known UK case recently, we were able to attract funding to develop a project, but it came with all sorts of thorns and barbs on it that made it very, very difficult to actually function. So I think it's really important that we have the right parties in the room when we're designing these products to make sure that they are actually viable for the industry. And this is a challenge for the EU as well. This particular project that I was involved in had a number of export credit agencies and traditional banks. And what we finished up with was what's the old acronym? Something like a camel is a horse designed by a committee. We finished up with something that was very cumbersome, had all sorts of requirements on it that actually made it very difficult to remain sustainable. And that ultimately led to the project being unsuccessful. And we come back to this: wider projects, major projects have overruns, wider major projects not get completed on time. Well, this contributes. This is one of the contributing factors for why we're not successful. There's nothing clean and smooth that's out there. I do like the comments of the rest of the team in terms of the market. And one of the things that I've really liked my time working with in the UK has been things like the World Gold Council, who have played a really pivotal role in that industry in terms of creating leadership throughout the globe. No one in there necessarily saying, I know the standards better than your country, but rather working together and saying, how are we going to actually lift our industry up as a whole? And the World Gold Council have got some great examples of the work they're doing right now with Chinese gold companies to come up with a unified set of standards for gold across the sector. There's a lot of work that they're doing in the illegal mining and artisanal mining space, which I think is also really, really critical when we think about minerals, and how we can influence shifts and paradigm shifts, not only at a local level, but also in a government level. I like the work of things like the EITI, and I know that the UK is very active in the EITI. The EITI has been a really, really important tool, particularly in Africa, in terms of actually helping people to understand ownership of minerals, which is really important, and helping bring out some of these issues around conflict of interest, sourcing. Once, as an example that's near and dear to my heart, I spent 10 years living in Ghana, and it wasn't until the Ghana Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative started up that we were able to realise that over 30% of the gold that was produced in Ghana was coming from non-formalised sources, let's put it that way. I'm not going to say illegal, but non-formalised sources. Once we knew the scale of the issue, we were then actually able to develop policy within the country to help try and address that. Why is non-formally produced minerals an issue for a country like Ghana? Well, they're missing out on royalty. And royalty is absolutely critical to value creation in that country. It's really important to the government being able to deliver services to local people. So, you know, we had an alignment of the minds when it came to dealing with that. So I'm just throwing out, trying to be positive again, some other examples out there of positive things that the European continent can do and has been successful at in the past that can actually help to move the industry forward and to create some of these linkages throughout the value chain.
Definitely. I'd like to come to you, Jane, because one of the things we often discuss is what are the examples or the allies that, as Europeans, we must be working with, both on the continent or you know, elsewhere where we work together. So I'd like your view on these responsible practices and how to improve the enabling conditions. But before we go there, I just want to rebound on what Philipa was saying, because one of the aspects of competitiveness is, of course, unlocking capital. And unfortunately, our colleagues are working in a room next door on one of the elements of that, which is the taxonomies. You might have picked up that in March 2023, when the EU Commission announced the CRM Act, it also undertook a process to bring mining under the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance. And, oh, our last speaker. Hello.
Sorry, I apologize.
One of the things that's really important to note is that at the moment we have the EU taxonomy the Platform for Sustainable Finance, trying to define criteria for mining to be viewed as a sustainable activity. At the same time, the UK, Australia, Canada, dozens of countries are working on taxonomies. I just want to attract the attention of everyone in the room to the fact that in most of these cases, and particularly on the EU side, mineral investment and the mining sector are not well represented in these processes. So we have got currently conversations about reallocating general capital who don't like us, haven't for a while, for the reasons you explained. We're trying to reallocate capital flows to this sector, which is pivotal to immediate and existential issues, and we're doing it without having the sector in the room. So if there's one thing I'd like to put out there today, please, please find out what's being discussed in terms of taxonomy. If you are invested in the EU or interested in capturing some of those European capital flows that could go to mining and minerals, get involved. Find out who's representing you in the taxonomy conversations. What's going to come out of the sustainable finance platform in the EU is so unfit for purpose that it would be better that it not be adopted. So sending the wrong political message about what we do as an industry, mining, but also more widely, the entire mineral value chain, is the exact wrong thing to do. And determining whether or not capital is responsible by investing in us is 50% of that equation. So that's my little call to all of you. Find out, and if necessary, please make your voice heard. I'm happy to talk to you about that after. But before we do that, thank you, and I'm sorry you missed the beginning.
Well, I truly apologize. It was a delay in flights and in everything. I'm coming from Bosnia. It's not easy. But,
absolutely.
But I made it.
Well done. Took me 12 hours to get here yesterday, too. So do you want to introduce yourself and perhaps give a view as to what can make European destinations competitive for investment attractiveness, but also to pursue the operations that you're currently, moving forward.
Thank you. So it's been a great honor to be invited in this panel and between you wonderful ladies. I'm Sanela Karić. I'm coming from Adriatic Metals, which is a British PLC company. It's a founder of the project in Bosnia and Herzegovina in a small town called Varris, which historically was always the mining town for over 100 years. I'm currently executive director of the national entity company, Adriatic Metals BH, and also executive director of corporate affairs on PLC level. So I'm here for almost 5 years, following the project from the scratch, starting as a junior project, permitting all the things through it, and now we are in operational stage. What I want to really emphasize about our project is that the timing of getting from development to the operational stage, which took us only 7 years, because approximately mining companies need at least 18 years. So when you compare with our act, EU Act, Act about shortening the permitting process, you can't meet those goals for 2030. It's not possible. When you calculate 15, 18 years for permitting, it's not possible. So it was a challenge, and I think our company is definitely one of the models to show how you can run process, starting first providing social license, working with the local community, and then going up on the government level. But really, what is really important is that mining projects or operational projects has to be linked with a historical mining area. Other areas are quite challenging and not well accepted. So this is why maybe the part of success of this story is it was a historically a mine always, and the people were educated and well known what to be expected from the mine and the mining business.
Which sends us right back to you and what responsible practices are, but more importantly, how we can make them better known and leverage them better.
I'm going to cut it short to give other people a chance to talk, but I've enjoyed looking at all the EU law that has emerged as the sustainability consultants. I've loved the principles and the paradigms in the law.
I love that you say you enjoy, because that's quite rare. Yes.
I do. I think they're quite clever. But in terms of sustainable practices on mines, my experience working around the world and my colleagues working around the world is there is a lot of sustainable practice in countries everywhere in the world. countries where people think that there isn't sustainable practice. There is a mix. There are bad companies and good companies. And I would like to comment that I think this consolidated mining standard that is coming together is a very, very important standard in the mining industry. It links to the work of the World Gold Council, ICMM, etc. I think it is a brilliant standard, and that should be used in terms of looking specifically at what standards apply to the mining industry. What makes a taxonomy quite difficult for the mining industry is closure, which is an unusual thing for the mining industry, and also this very strong requirement for local value creation. How does that fit into the taxonomy? It could be under human rights, but it's not under your human rights safeguards, and it's not in those criteria there. But the last thing I just wanted to say is that I'm starting to see governments around the world, and it's not necessarily a whole government, but maybe at provincial level, providing loans or tax incentives that are helping companies to develop their project responsibly. And I know the next panel or the next session is on, I can't pronounce, I was corrected literally the other day on my pronunciation of, I say Ontario, but I believe that's completely the wrong pronunciation. So I'll be
Potato, potato, it doesn't matter.
Okay. That is a province that has fantastic incentives for the mining industry, for sustainable mining incentives, for example, in terms of the introduction of electrical vehicles into mines. I recently did a due diligence on a project in Canada, I can't say where, but that project is very close to accessing funding to help it make sure that it's developed sustainability and also develop infrastructure that it needs in a correct way. And I do think that governments could do more to help projects develop sustainability in that way.
Yeah, so fundamentally creating the enabling conditions for responsible investment to be fostered.
Yep.
Yeah, cost of capital, that's the name of the game.
And speaking to Sanela's point, Bosnia-Herzegovina is not a unique case when it comes to having a 7+ year life to develop a project. There are very few jurisdictions in the world that would actually do much better than that. And as Sanela pointed out, greenfields, we're talking even longer. So if you're a small company and you've got to keep yourself afloat through baseline studies, feasibility studies, metallurgical test work, yada, 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 and then you've got to keep actually exploring because you've got mineral tenement requirements that you have to meet in the jurisdiction that you're working in, minimum expenditure requirements, minimum employment requirements. All of this takes money. So right now, as a global economy, we're very reliant on the existing producers. And so I think that the work we're doing needs to look at both lenses. It needs to look at clearing out the pathway for the new projects, the new greenfields projects. But we also have to look at the existing producers, and particularly the energy-intensive end of the spectrum, and how can we actually help these people to move forward with their transition plans. Jane alluded to someone she's done a due diligence on. I've done one recently on somewhere in Europe, and the same thing was happening. The actual country was supplying funds to support that mining operation, which was energy intensive, to actually move down the spectrum on its decarbonisation agenda. Electric fleet, helping to support development of renewable power, because this was a remote operation, it was off-grid, and they were using their own diesel grid system, so they were helping this. And it was in a perfect location for solar. They were helping to build a solar array for their operation. So I think there's a lot we can do also with the existing energy-intensive sector, and specific funding products to help those transition projects, even if right now we can't necessarily see our way to funding mining. Maybe what we can see our way to funding is solar power system for mining project. So that there might be, again, some kind of transition funding arrangements that we can come up while we deal with these taxonomy issues and actually get green and sustainable mining back into the taxonomies in a meaningful way.
Thanks very much. I did want to discuss circularity so that we take a whole value chain approach, but I'm looking at the authorities. Do we still have 2 minutes 2.
Right.
Take it home, Marge.
Yes, okay, so let's just drag the conversation away from mining. I appreciate the audience, but building a competitive European continent is,
What?
we've got to talk a lot more about the rest of the value chain.
Yep.
We've got to talk about circularity, which we can be very good at because we've proven we can be very good at it. We need more focus there. And again, just to pull it all the way to the demand side, we need more focus on developing metal-efficient technologies because we've seen the projections. There are issues with supply and demand. Batteries are not the energy transition. Batteries are part of the energy transition. Road transport is 20% of our energy consumption. Of that, half is commercial and heavy vehicles, so intensively used vehicles. If you solve batteries, you've solved maybe 10% of our energy consumption. There's a lot more to talk about. We need to do it in a metals-efficient way because we don't have the metals to do everything in a metal-intensive way. This is where Europe can shine. And I'd like to see more attention paid to that. Mining is crucially important. There's a lot more to this conversation, including circularity, including metals-efficient technologies for the rest of the economy. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. We could talk about this for days. I think we've taken more time than was allocated, so thank you very much, ladies. Thank you. Do you have any questions? No?